So he was just 67, sadly, when he died, much too early, and we still miss him a lot. In his early days, he was known as Wilkie, but by the time I met him, he was always known as Jim. So if you'll forgive me, I'll tend to refer to him as Jim through the talk, but you know I'm talking about Jim Wilkinson. He studied under Hardy, but I don't believe that's got anything to do with his middle name. I think his mother's maiden name was Hardy, and I'm assuming that's where the middle name came from. The talk I'm giving is the most non-technical talk at this workshop, but I wanted to talk about Jim, and especially for some of you younger people who I'm sure have all heard of Jim Wilkinson, hopefully read at least the algebraic eigenvalue problem, but perhaps don't know so much about him. So I just wanted to have this opportunity to talk about him. So his career, that's a very brief summary of his career. He went to Trinity College, Cambridge when he was 16, and he was twice the most distinguished student in any subject, let alone mathematics. And he graduated when he was just 19. He started to do a PhD, actually working with Hardy, but then World War II came along and he was drafted into the scientific service, working in the Ministry of Supply, initially at Cambridge, who had an outpost there, but then he went to a place called Fort Halstead, where he was for most of his war service, and worked on various applications, but of course some of these applications required numerical solutions, and that's where he first got his taste of numerical analysis. And in 1946, after the war, he went to the National Physical Laboratory and was there all the rest of his career till I think officially 1980, but in practice he finished in 1979. And he was promoted to Chief Scientific Officer in 74, and that was a very rare promotion, especially for someone who was doing purely scientific research. I think there have only been perhaps two other people who've had that status. What are his contributions? Well, again, a very brief summary, and there's an awful lot behind those. But he went to NPL to work with Alan Turing, and Alan Turing had designed a machine called ACE, Automatic Computing Engine. The powers that be at NPL decided it was too big a project, and I'll explain in a moment a bit more about what happened, but they finished up building something called Pilot ACE, which was meant to be a sort of test machine for ACE to see is it worth carrying on to build ACE. In practice, they had to use it, and Wilkinson used it to solve many problems. Turing left because of his upset about the lack of funding for ACE, and Jim Wilkinson finished up really in charge of the project of building Pilot ACE and getting it working. Of course, we all know him for his backward error analysis, and I'll say more about that later on, partly through his experience with things like Pilot ACE and some of the other work he did at NPL. He came to understand error analysis, and he developed his theory of backward error analysis. As well as that, he did a lot of analysis of algorithms for numerical linear algebra, particularly in dense linear equations and dense eigenvalue problems. And that led to his book, The Algebraic Eigenvalue Problem. And importantly, he was interested not only in developing the algorithms, but making sure they were available for people to use the algorithms and solve the problems they wanted to solve. So he was very instrumental in developing software implementing those algorithms, and I'll say a bit more about that. And he was encouraging to people and to projects, and there are several people in the audience today who I know Jim will have given encouragement to. And for me, he was so important. He gave me a lot of encouragement, and he affected the path of my career very much. But he was a lovely person as well. So he had a lifelong marriage to Heather. They had 2 children, Jenny and David. Sadly, very sadly, Jenny died when she was only 26 of cancer. And of course, the whole family felt it hard, and Jim particularly felt it very hard. But David is still well and alive, but he lives in the US, and his wife is going through treatment at the moment, so he felt he wasn't able to come here. But you'll see a couple of pictures shortly that he kindly sent to me. So I've already said he was a warm, caring person, but he also had a lovely sense of humour, and I'm sure Cleve is going to mention 1 or 2 stories about Jim. He'll be much better at that than I am. He loved his food, his drink, and his music. He was an encyclopedia of classical music. Leslie Fox used to say that he would play brief pieces of some piece of classical music, and Jim could very quickly say what they were. And he was practical. They had a camper van, for example. They'd go off to France, and I think took their bicycles with them. And he did a lot of maintenance on his on this camper van, and I think sometimes to Heather's dismay he insisted on doing the decorating and repairs at home as well. So these are the pictures that David kindly sent me. Of course, this is their marriage, 17th of March 1945, and on the left is his younger sister Pam, who's 10 years younger than Jim. She's now 90, sadly not very well, so she wasn't able to come here. But it'd be lovely if we can say something about the meeting and pass it on to Pam. Next to Pam is Tom Vickers, who some of you may have heard of. Jim and Tom Vickers met at Fort Halstead, and later on they both worked at NPL on Pilot Ace. And Tom died just this March at 99, so he's only just passed away. Jim and Heather, of course, and David, I'm afraid, couldn't remember who the person on the left, right, is, but he was sure she was a friend of Heather's. But a few years ago, Pam, Jim's sister, sent this lovely message to NAG, because NAG had supplied some information about Jim for Pam, which she'd asked about. And you can see Jim was there to watch me unpack the stocking hanging on the brass bedknob. It seemed so wonderful when one was 3 or 4 and there was only flickering candlelight. So because she was 10 years younger than Jim, he seemed to be very fond of her and looked after her. And there are 4 MP3 files that Nick has made available on the Wilkinson website, and you can hear Pam talking about life with Jim, and they're really lovely, lovely pieces, lovely words to hear. Before I move on to Alan Turing, I think I can see 2 of Jim's, a nephew and a niece. 2 nephews. Right. So this is, yeah. So it was Liz who couldn't make it. So do, in the intervals, if you want to know more about Jim, speak to these people here. So you're very welcome here, and it's lovely that you could come. So Jim went to work nominally half-time for Alan Turing, and the other half-time he was supposed to be working in the desk computing section with people like Leslie Fox. In practice, he almost worked for full-time for Alan Turing, and he wondered whether Turing employed him half-time because he was so confident Jim could do the work quickly, or whether he wanted to see if he could do the work and wasn't sure. That's not quite the quote from Jim, but that was the sentiment.
They were about the same age, weren't they?
I guess they were, yes. Yes, I hadn't thought of that, but yes, yeah. There's a book written by Alan Turing's nephew, Dermot Turing, and these pictures are in his book. A lot of you, especially people here, will know that the portrait of Alan Turing running is on the staircase as you come up from the entrance lobby. This is him doing the 3-mile handicap race in Boxing Day 1946. And he gave the winner a 10-yard start, but was beaten by a foot apparently at the end. He very nearly would have been selected for the London Olympics in 1948, but he'd injured his foot. But he was a very good marathon runner, and Jim talked about Turing running to meetings, much to the surprise of the other people at the meeting. Jim himself would often go by bike to the meetings. He didn't run there. He also rode for King's College, Cambridge, and I think this is at Bletchley Park. Sorry to say, I've just forgotten for the moment, but you can see his name on the end of the oar there, so that's an oar that they used but then got painted up. So the other half that Jim was supposed to be working with was with people like Leslie Fox. He also worked with Harry Huskey, who was American. Harry Huskey died in just 2017 at the age of 101, and he was quite an amazing character, I think. They worked, for example, solving linear equations on adapted Hollerith machines, and used, of course, Gaussian elimination, as we'd expect. Did a bit of iterative refinement. There's a paper that describes how they used the punch card machine by the three of them, and it makes quite interesting reading. Harry Huskey went on to work, or set up, I think, Bendix. Cleve will probably know better than me. And this is the G15, which some people say was the first personal computer. And this is him in later life, still with one of these machines in his garage. I wouldn't want one of those on my desk, but it was a small machine for the day. And Leslie Fox has a blue plaque at Didsbury railway station. So if you want to go to Didsbury and have a look, you can see this plaque. And Tom Kilburn has a plaque next door to it. And Tom, of course, worked here on the Manchester Mark I machine, Manchester Baby machine, so he has a close tie with Manchester.
Kilburn and Fox went to school together.
They went to the same school. It'll come to me in a minute, I've forgotten the name. Sorry?
Dewsbury Grammar School.
No, it begins with a Wheelwrights, thank you. Oh, it says it there, yes. Wheelwright Grammar School, they did both go there. And those of you that know Jeff Hayes, who was a statistician at NPL, he also went there. So here's Jim, Gerald Allway and Eric Newman, I think, working on Pilot Ace. So this is getting ready for the demonstration to the press of Pilot Ace. And there's Jim close up, taken from the same picture, but you can see in the early days the input was via switches and the output was via, I can't point because the output was via lights on the display there, but later on it was punch cards used for input and output on that machine. I have an article that goes with this talk with a lot more detail, and it's got detail of the size of this machine. I mean, it was a really small machine. We're talking about bytes of memory, not gigabytes. After the demonstration of the machine, which was over 3 days, went successfully. A bit later on, the Daily Mirror had a cartoon, and this is just one piece from the cartoon. You wouldn't be able to read it if I put the whole cartoon on the slide there, but you see Jim Wilkinson gets a mention in this cartoon in the Daily Mirror about Pilot Ace. Well, as I mentioned earlier, he found, to his surprise, he was expected to use this pilot machine, and indeed he did. And this is perhaps his first technical article about using the machine, not about the machine itself. He'd written a lot of information about that. It's 30 pages, written in 1954, and about the calculation of latent roots and vectors of matrices. Nick often pulls my leg for having called them that, but Jim called them those. Of course, now we call them eigenvalues. And amazingly, they could solve up to 60 by 60 eigenvalue problems on this machine. I don't think anyone had solved eigenvalue problems that sort of size before. NPL, for example, had looking into flutter problems, and I think that was one source of the problems they were solving. And they used essentially the power method, but variants of the power method with things like shifts and deflation. And it was looking at the results of these problems that really finalized Jim's view of backward error analysis and led to his theory of backward error analysis. So this work on solving these problems was really important for all of us, for what it led to. Here's a couple of slides of Jim's. I'm not expecting you to be able to read them, but at the top of the first of them it says personal history. Talks about problems he'd solved and using backward error analysis. On the second one you can see it says decisive, and he goes on to show that he found that the residual for eigenvalue problems was always, in his experience, for the methods they were using, very small, and that led him to, if you look at these towards the middle, you can see A minus R x bar transpose, etc. in there, and that's really expressing that you've solved exactly a nearby problem. So if you think of the Rx bar transpose as an E matrix, an error matrix, that was his, although we often think of it as being through the linear equations that he developed his theory, his decisive moment was for the eigenvalue problem, and the supportive bit he's talking about solving linear equations. So again, that was very important to all of us now. Jim developed the theory, but he never claimed to be the first person to do a backward error analysis, and one of the people he gives big credit to is Wallace Givens, who wrote a technical paper. Other people had done it, such as Turing himself and von Neumann and Goldstein, but the error analysis that Givens gave, Jim was very appreciative of. So that's a picture of Jim with Wallace Givens. I'm not sure where that is. Jack Argon might know. That's at Argon, right. And Givens, I guess, was there at working there at the time. Yeah. Two other people that were very important to Jim. On Jim's left is Alston Householder, and Jim very much liked the work that Householder had been done, and as we know, used Householder transformations a lot in his own work. And to his right is Olga Towsky-Todd, who also worked at NPL. They left and joined in the same year, but I'm convinced that they overlapped because Jim used to tell me about Olga bringing him these flutter problems to solve. So it could be Olga Towsky-Todd or Olga Towsky who got Jim into eigenvalue problems, but I can't be certain about that. Well, there's his two famous books, Rounding Errors in Algebraic Processes originally published in '63, and Dover brought out a reprint in '94, and the algebraic eigenvalue problem is still in print, as Nick mentioned, still gets a lot of citations, and I've forgotten the dates now, Nick might remember, but it was amongst the top 100 citations in computer science, computer mathematics. Yeah. So, extremely important books that influenced a lot of the work in our area. After the war, many young ladies joined things like NPL and worked on the holorith machines in places like NPL and became computer operators, many of them without very much mathematics background, but were extremely important in the development of many of these machines. Jim had, well, 3 people who particularly he worked with and has joint papers, and if you look at the handbook, which I'll show in a moment, you'll see joint papers with Gwen Peters, someone Martin, and Hilary Bowdler. Roger Martin. Both Gwen and Hilary are still alive and doing very well. I'm afraid I don't know about Roger Martin, so if anyone knows where he went, and I know he left NPL to go on to earn more money, went into private industry, but beyond that I don't know. But Gwen was someone that Jim worked particularly closely with, and she did a lot of the testing for the examples in the algebraic eigenvalue problem. She was an operator on Pilot ACE, had worked on holorith machines, desk calculators as well. She's alive and doing remarkably well. Pam and I went to visit her 2 weeks ago, something like that. And she was amazing, I have to say. Her memory was fantastic. And she showed me her copy of the algebraic eigenvalue problem, which has this dedication to Gwen in appreciation of the contribution to the practical realization of the results, Jim. So I think that's a lovely touch. And this is her in 1945. There's her at the controls of the DEUCE machine, which followed Pilot ACE and actually came before the ACE machine, which was the full version that Turing had designed. A very important book, Handbook for Automatic Computation, had algol programs, I should say, for many of the dense linear algebra problems, and that book was a huge influence. It was the only publication where Wilkinson's name comes before the others, and Wilkinson really regretted that he'd allowed Christian Reinsch to do that, but Christian Reinsch was insistent Jim should come first. They were the editors, of course.
We could tell many stories about Reinsch.
Yes,
too.
yeah. I mean, here are just 4 projects that it influenced, and all have dedications to Wilkinson in them. Nick's book also dedicates to Turing. There's a cricket match with Jim teaching Cleve here how to play cricket. Brian Ford of NAG is down at the bottom here, so NAG being that NAG, and he was director of NAG at the time. Nick's shown that picture already, but he also won the von Neumann Award in that same year, which at the moment is unique. There's Heather with Vera, thank you, and Leslie Fox at the Gatlinburg, Oxford. Many well-known people that you would know about are in that picture. After Jim's sad death, we had a meeting at...
I give some of my time to him, so whether he'd talk about it.
No. So there's conference proceedings, and it's still very readable. Nick has an article in there. Jim was very helpful to NAG over many years, and the introduction is still in the documentation for NAG. And he had, just let me finish with this. Two main classes of rounding error analysis are not, as my audience might imagine, backwards and forwards, but rather one's own and other people's. One's own is, of course, a model of lucidity. That of others only serves to obscure the essential simplicity of the matter in hand. So that was typical Jim. NAG has its offices named after Jim, and Heather opened those offices in 1989, and that's the last slide, and that's a beautiful picture of Jim, which a number of us have, and I think it typifies Jim really very well. So thank you. I'm sorry if I've gone slightly over.
Okay, we have time for questions and comments, but please let Max pass you the mic so that we can capture that on the recording. So, Nick,
Cleve, I cede my question to Cleve.
I've never been sure how much programming Wilkinson did. How much did he actually?
Well, certainly in the early days on Pilot Ace, I mean, he did a lot of programming, and you can see some examples. I mean, he was programming at machine assembly level.
But the
at that
Peters and
stage.
Wilkinson.
But when it comes on to that, yes, people like Peters, Hillary were really the programmers. Yes.
And Jim didn't do much himself, did he?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, I can't talk too much about the early days. I don't know, but he certainly appreciated them and relied on them for that work.
Can I just say something about that? He taught classes at Stanford which had programming homework, and he wrote code as well as his teaching assistants for those.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that he couldn't program.
No, but I mean, he made up very hard problems and sometimes wrote the code to solve them.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about Jim and Turing and linear algebra, because there is this puzzle that Turing is the name we associate with inventing condition numbers, for example.
Yeah.
And of course, Wilkinson and Turing are connected, but what about the linear algebra connection? Do we know anything about how much Jim talked about these things with Turing and how much came from Turing?
I really don't think I know the answer to that. I mean, he certainly did talk to some extent with Turing about it, and of course I think it must have led to... So Turing worked with them, for example, on solving a system of 18 equations, and Jim always said Turing wasn't very good at using a Brunsviga calculator. If you don't know what a Brunsviga is, there's some outside. And that led to Turing's paper where he does talk about condition numbers and error analysis.
But Turing didn't have an idea of the growth, the pivot growth. There's a quantity epsilon in Turing's analysis that you could see what epsilon was if you were doing it by hand, but doing it automatically. So what Wilkinson did was that amazing bound on the growth of the elements during the elimination, and Turing didn't know what that was.
Any more questions or comments? Okay, well let's thank Sven again.
Thank you.